Snow drifted silently beyond the towering arched windows of the Morty mansion, coating the iron gates and marble fountains in white frost, while inside, beneath glittering black crystal chandeliers imported from Venice nearly a century earlier, Chicago's most powerful people laughed over champagne and blood money. The ballroom glowed gold and obsidian beneath candlelight reflected across polished marble floors. Senators stood beside judges. Billionaires drank beside men rumored to have ordered executions with a single phone call. Classical violin music floated through the air with deceptive elegance, while waiters in white gloves carried silver trays through the crowd like ghosts trained never to hear anything they witnessed. At the center of it all stood Adriana Bellucci Morti. 5 years earlier, she had arrived in Chicago from Florence with delicate hands trained for piano keys instead of violence, a young woman whose entire world had once revolved around music halls, ballet rehearsals, and dreams too soft for the brutal empire she had married into. Tonight, wrapped in a black silk gown with long sleeves that concealed how thin she had become, she looked less like the wife of Chicago's most feared mafia don, and more like a candle moments before the wind extinguished it. Her amber eyes remained fixed on the ballroom crowd, while whispers moved around her in invisible circles. Poor thing. 5 years and still no child. The Morty bloodline is ending with her. Adriana heard every word even when they were spoken quietly behind crystal glasses. Especially tonight. At the far end of the ballroom, seated beneath a massive oil painting of dead Morty ancestors, sat Vittoria Morty herself, 80 years old, sharp-eyed, draped in diamonds and black lace like a queen dressed for a funeral. Her thin fingers rested atop a silver cane while her cold gaze remained locked on Adriana with open disappointment. The old woman had once welcomed Adriana warmly. That was before the diagnosis. Infertile. The word had poisoned everything afterward. The first year had brought sympathy. The second year had brought pressure disguised as concern. By the third year, doctors had become permanent fixtures in Adriana's life. Specialists from New York, clinics in Switzerland, endless blood tests, endless prayers, endless silent crying in cold bathrooms where nobody could hear her break apart. And through all of it, Matteo had remained silent. Not cruel. Not gentle either. Silent. That silence had hurt far worse than hatred ever could. Across the ballroom, Don Matteo Morty stood surrounded by politicians and capos alike, his broad shoulders wrapped in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that made him look less like a man and more like a weapon carved from darkness. At 38, Matteo carried power the way other men carried shadows, effortlessly, dangerously. People lowered their voices when he passed. Men feared him. Women admired him. But Adriana knew something nobody else did. Her husband looked exhausted. Not physically. Soul-deep exhausted. His dark eyes found hers across the ballroom for one brief second, and beneath the mask of the feared mafia don, she saw something flicker there. Pain. Then it disappeared instantly. A string quartet finished playing near the staircase as Matteo slowly lifted his champagne glass. The entire ballroom quieted. Even the politicians stopped speaking. Matteo stepped toward the center of the room beneath the black chandeliers, while snowstorm winds rattled faintly against the tall windows. "My friends," he said calmly, his deep voice carrying through the ballroom with practiced authority, "thank you for attending tonight's charity gala in honor of St. Catherine's Children's Hospital." Soft applause followed. Adriana's stomach twisted violently. Another wave of nausea rose unexpectedly into her throat, sharp and sudden enough that her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. For the past 3 weeks, the dizzy spells had become worse. She had nearly fainted twice already, but stress could do strange things to the body, and she refused to embarrass herself by appearing weak tonight. Then Matteo spoke again. "There is also a personal matter I wish to address publicly." The room became still. Too still. Adriana slowly looked at him. Matteo's jaw tightened almost invisibly before he reached inside his tuxedo jacket and removed a folded set of papers. Her heartbeat stopped. No, no, not here. Not like this. His voice remained cold, controlled, almost emotionless. After careful consideration, Adriana and I have agreed to dissolve our marriage. The ballroom erupted into whispers so quickly, it sounded like snakes hissing through silk. Adriana stared at him in complete silence. For one terrible second, she thought she might collapse right there beneath the chandeliers. Matteo continued speaking like every word was being dragged from his throat through broken glass. This decision was mutual and made with respect. Mutual. The lie shattered something inside her chest. Across the room, Vittoria Morty closed her eyes in visible satisfaction. One of the older capos quietly nodded approval. Adriana suddenly understood everything. The family had finally won. An heir mattered more than love, more than loyalty, more than 5 years beside him. Matteo approached slowly until he stood directly before her. A lawyer appeared silently beside him carrying a silver tray. On top rested divorce papers and a black fountain pen. The ballroom watched like wolves circling a wounded animal. Adriana lifted her eyes toward Matteo's face. "Is this truly what you want?" she whispered softly enough that only he could hear. Something inside his expression almost cracked. Almost. But then his mask returned. "It's what needs to happen." The words sliced through her. Not because they were cruel. Because they sounded rehearsed. Like he had forced himself to say them 1,000 times before tonight. Adriana's vision blurred slightly again. Another wave of dizziness struck hard enough that she reached subtly for the edge of the table to steady herself. Nobody noticed except Matteo. His hand twitched once at his side. The smallest movement. The movement of a man trying not to reach for the woman he was destroying. Adriana looked down at the papers, then slowly signed her name. Adriana Bellucci Morti. The ink trembled slightly near the final letter. When she finished, the ballroom erupted into polite applause so hollow it made her stomach turn. Matteo closed his eyes briefly. Just once, as though the sound physically hurt him. Adriana handed the pen back without another word. Whatever remained of her heart had frozen solid beneath those chandeliers. She turned gracefully despite the humiliation burning through her veins and walked toward the grand entrance of the mansion, while whispers followed her like ghosts. Nobody stopped her. Not even Matteo. Outside, the snowstorm swallowed her instantly. The freezing wind lashed against her face as she descended the marble staircase alone, her black heels slipping slightly against the icy stone. Her breathing became uneven, too fast. The nausea returned violently. Halfway toward the iron gates, her vision darkened. The world tilted. Adriana stumbled forward suddenly, collapsing to her knees in the snow beside the gate pillars, while one trembling hand instinctively clutched her stomach. A sharp pain twisted low in her abdomen. Across the street, hidden behind falling snow, 3 black SUVs sat silently with their headlights off. Watching. Waiting. And inside the mansion behind her, Matteo Morty stood alone beneath the black chandeliers, staring through the frozen windows at the woman he had just let walk out of his life. The snowstorm swallowed Adriana Bellucci Morty whole the moment she collapsed beside the iron gates of the Morty mansion. Cold wind tore through the black silk of her evening gown, while snowflakes melted against her pale skin like tiny drops of ice water. Her breathing became ragged, uneven, and somewhere behind her, beyond the towering gates and black marble walls, the orchestra inside the mansion continued playing as though her entire life had not just been destroyed beneath those chandeliers. For several seconds she remained on her knees in the snow, one trembling hand pressed against her stomach, while nausea twisted violently through her body again. The dizziness had become unbearable now. The world spun around her in blurred streaks of white and gold light, and she suddenly realized she could taste blood where her teeth had cut into the inside of her lip. Then headlights flashed across the storm. A black umbrella appeared over her head before the snow could completely soak her hair, One of the Morty security drivers stood beside her silently, his expression carefully blank, though she noticed the discomfort in his eyes. Even the guards pitied her tonight. "Mrs. Morty," he said softly before immediately correcting himself. "Miss Bellucci, the car is ready." The correction hurt more than the divorce papers. Adriana slowly forced herself to stand despite the weakness threatening to pull her back down. She did not look back toward the mansion. She refused to give herself that final humiliation. Because if she looked up at those glowing windows, if she saw Matteo standing there watching her disappear into the storm, she knew whatever strength remained inside her would finally collapse completely. The black sedan carried her away from the estate through streets buried beneath snow and midnight silence. Chicago's skyline shimmered in the distance like frozen glass, while tears slid soundlessly down Adriana's cheeks. She wiped them away angrily. No more crying. She had spent 5 years crying quietly in empty bathrooms after fertility appointments, after cruel dinners with the Morty Council, after nights lying awake beside a husband who touched her gently but never spoke the words she needed most. She was done begging to be loved by a world that only valued her womb. But deep inside her body, something felt wrong. The nausea worsened during the drive. Her hands shook uncontrollably now. Sharp cramps came and went beneath her ribs while dizziness clouded her vision again. By the time the sedan stopped outside the luxury hotel Matteo had arranged for her temporary stay, Adriana nearly fainted stepping onto the sidewalk. Upstairs inside the silent hotel suite, she barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting violently into the sink. Her body trembled afterward from exhaustion. She stared at herself in the mirror under the harsh white light and hardly recognized the woman staring back. Her amber eyes looked hollow, her face thinner than ever. Yet beneath the heartbreak and exhaustion, something else lingered there now. Fear. At 3 in the morning, unable to ignore the pain any longer, Adriana wrapped herself in a wool coat and quietly slipped out of the hotel through the underground exit. Snow still fell heavily as she entered a small 24-hour emergency clinic several blocks away, where nobody would recognize the former wife of Chicago's most feared mafia don. The elderly female doctor examined her gently while Adriana sat trembling beneath fluorescent lights. Blood pressure dangerously low, severe exhaustion, persistent nausea, fainting spells. The doctor listened carefully before ordering immediate blood work and an ultrasound simply to rule out complications. Adriana almost laughed bitterly when she heard the word ultrasound. After 5 years of infertility specialists, failed treatments, and devastating diagnoses, there was nothing left to discover inside her body except emptiness. 40 minutes later, the doctor returned strangely pale. She closed the office door quietly before sitting across from Adriana with visible disbelief in her eyes. "Miss Bellucci," she whispered carefully, "I reviewed your medical history twice because I thought there had to be a mistake." Adriana frowned weakly. "What mistake?" The doctor slowly turned the monitor screen toward her. A tiny flickering heartbeat glowed against the darkness. The room went silent. Adriana stopped breathing. "No," she whispered instantly, shaking her head. "That's impossible." The doctor's voice softened. "You are approximately 8 weeks pregnant." The words shattered reality itself. 8 weeks. Her mind instantly calculated the truth. The baby had already existed the night Matteo divorced her beneath those black chandeliers. Tears flooded Adriana's eyes so violently she could barely see the screen anymore. One trembling hand slowly moved toward her stomach while her entire body shook. For 5 years she had prayed for this miracle until hope itself died inside her. And now, after losing everything, after signing away her marriage, after walking alone into the snow believing herself broken beyond repair, life had quietly begun growing inside her all along. But then another realization struck harder than the first. If the Morty family discovered this child existed, they would never let her disappear. A Morty heir was not simply a baby. It was power, legacy, blood, and men had killed for far less than that. Outside the clinic window, snow continued falling over Chicago while across the street, parked silently beneath a broken street lamp, a black SUV sat with its headlights off. Watching the building. 3 days after the divorce gala, the Morty mansion no longer sounded like a home. It sounded like a fortress preparing for war. Heavy footsteps echoed through marble corridors at all hours of the night. Armed guards rotated every 4 hours instead of every 8. Black SUVs came and went through the iron gates beneath the cover of darkness, while whispers spread through Chicago's underworld that Don Mateo Morty had become even more dangerous after losing his wife. Nobody knew the truth. The truth was far worse. At nearly 2 in the morning, Mateo stood alone inside his private study on the 3rd floor of the mansion, staring out through rain-streaked windows overlooking the frozen city skyline. A half-empty glass of whiskey rested untouched beside his hand. The fireplace behind him burned low, throwing shadows across the room lined with old Italian oil paintings and shelves filled with leather-bound books nobody had opened in years. On the massive oak desk before him sat Adriana's wedding ring. He had been staring at it for nearly an hour. The gold band gleamed faintly beneath the dim desk lamp, small and delicate compared to the violence surrounding every other part of his life. Mateo slowly picked it up between his fingers again, his jaw tightening as memories struck him one after another with merciless precision. Adriana laughing softly while playing piano barefoot late at night. Adriana asleep against his chest during thunderstorms. Adriana crying silently in hospital bathrooms after fertility treatments she thought he never knew about. He knew about all of them. Every single one. The guilt hollowed him out from the inside. A knock suddenly broke the silence. Enter. Luca Romano stepped into the study wearing a dark overcoat dusted with snow, his expression grim beneath the scar running along his jawline. Luca had served Mateo since they were teenagers running weapons through South Side warehouses together. He was one of the only men alive Mateo trusted completely. She's gone, Luca said quietly. Mateo did not move. Explain. The hotel suite is empty. She checked out less than an hour ago under another name. Luca hesitated briefly before continuing. Our people lost her near Union Station. That finally made Mateo turn around. For the first time in years, real emotion flashed openly across his face. Fear. Not fear for himself. Fear for her. Find her, he said immediately, voice low enough to become terrifying. I don't care what it costs. Luca studied him carefully. Mateo, if she truly wants to disappear. She doesn't disappear alone in this city. Mateo's voice hardened instantly. Not after what I did. The room fell silent again. Luca had seen Mateo order executions without blinking. He had seen him negotiate million-dollar territory deals while bullets flew outside restaurant windows. But he had never seen him like this. Broken quietly from the inside while still trying to stand upright like nothing had happened. Mateo turned back toward the window slowly. The council thinks divorcing her solved the problem. His voice became bitter now. They think I chose bloodline over my wife. But you didn't. No, Mateo closed his eyes briefly. I chose to spare her from becoming a prisoner inside this family forever. Outside the mansion, snow continued falling heavily across Chicago, while somewhere beyond the city Adriana disappeared farther from him by the hour. Then Luca spoke again. There's something else. Mateo immediately sensed danger in his tone. Luca stepped forward and placed a sealed brown envelope onto the desk. One of our contacts inside St. Vincent Emergency Clinic called me 30 minutes ago. Adriana was there 2 nights ago. Mateo frowned slightly. Why? She collapsed, Luca paused. They ran blood work. Something cold moved through the room. Slowly, Mateo opened the envelope. Inside was a copied medical report. His eyes scanned the page once, then stopped completely. For several seconds, the entire world seemed to freeze around him. Pregnant. 8 weeks. Mateo stared at the word like his mind, physically, could not process it. Impossible. The doctors had told them there was almost no chance. Years of treatments, years of grief, years watching Adriana slowly blame herself for something that was never truly her fault. And now, His hand tightened around the paper hard enough to crumple it. The baby existed before the divorce. Adriana had already been carrying his child beneath those chandeliers, while he publicly destroyed their marriage. A strangled breath escaped him before he suddenly slammed both hands onto the desk with enough force to rattle the whiskey glass beside him. The sound echoed violently through the study. Luca remained silent. Matteo lowered his head slowly, breathing unevenly now, his shoulders rigid beneath his black dress shirt. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded shattered beneath the rage. "She was pregnant," he whispered hoarsely, "and she stood there alone while I let them humiliate her." For the first time since his father's funeral 20 years earlier, Luca saw Matteo, Morty look close to completely falling apart. But the nightmare was only beginning. Because neither of them noticed the hidden camera, positioned silently inside the corner of the study bookshelf. And 12 miles away in Brighton Beach, inside a dimly lit nightclub owned by the Russian Bratva, a bald man with silver rings across his fingers watched the live surveillance feed with slow amusement. Viktor Sokolov, one of the most feared mafia leaders on the East Coast. He leaned back in his chair, while cigar smoke curled through the darkness around him. Pregnant. The Morty heir existed after all. Victor smiled coldly. And suddenly, Adriana Bellucci, Morty became the most valuable woman in America. By the time spring arrived in Maine, Adriana Bellucci had almost convinced herself she no longer belonged to the world of the Morty family. The ocean town of Blackwater Cove sat hidden along the rocky coastline like a forgotten secret, wrapped in salt air, fog, and silence. Tourists came only during summer months, leaving the town nearly empty for most of the year except for fishermen, bookstore owners, and old women who watched storms from wooden porches wrapped in knitted shawls. It was the perfect place for someone trying to disappear. And Adriana had become very good at disappearing. 7 months pregnant now, she lived quietly above an antique bookstore owned by a widowed woman named Eleanor Pierce, who asked few questions and accepted cash rent without curiosity. Adriana restored old pianos during the day in the back room of a music shop near the harbor, her fingers carefully bringing dead instruments back to life, while her own heart slowly tried learning how to beat again. She no longer wore expensive silk gowns or diamond jewelry. She wore oversized sweaters, long wool coats, and soft scarves that concealed the gentle curve of her stomach whenever she walked through town. Nobody in Blackwater Cove knew she had once stood beside the most feared mafia don in Chicago. But even here, peace never truly reached her. Because every few nights she noticed the same black SUV parked somewhere near the harbor. Always distant. Always watching. Never approaching. At first she believed paranoia from her old life had followed her north. But after weeks passed and the vehicle continued appearing near the docks, outside the grocery store, or parked across from the bookstore during heavy rainstorms, Adriana realized something terrifying. Someone had found her. The realization poisoned every peaceful moment afterward. That evening, dark storm clouds rolled heavily across the Atlantic while freezing rain lashed against the harbor windows. Adriana finished closing the music shop shortly after 8 and pulled her coat tighter around herself before stepping into the storm. Wind whipped her chestnut hair violently across her face, while thunder rumbled somewhere far out over the ocean. The streets were nearly empty. Too empty. Her heartbeat quickened instantly. Halfway down Harbor Street, Adriana noticed movement behind her. 2 men. Large, silent, wearing black jackets despite the rain. Not tourists. Not fishermen. Every survival instinct she had developed during 5 years beside Matteo, Morty screamed danger. She quickened her pace immediately, one hand instinctively protecting her stomach beneath her coat. The baby shifted suddenly inside her, almost as though sensing her fear. Behind her, footsteps accelerated. Miss Bellucci, one of the men called calmly. She froze. Nobody here knew that name. Adriana turned sharply, rainwater dripping down her face while panic surged violently through her chest. The taller man stepped beneath a flickering street lamp, revealing a scar stretching from his eyebrow to his jaw. Russian. She recognized the accent instantly. Her blood turned cold. Mr. Sokolov would like a conversation, he said politely. Adriana took one slow step backward. I don't know any Sokolov. The second man smiled faintly, but he knows you. Then both men lunged forward at once. Adriana tried to scream, but one grabbed her arm violently before she could move. Fear exploded through her entire body. She twisted desperately, striking one attacker across the face with surprising force, but the other man caught her wrist hard enough to bruise instantly. Get her in the car, the scarred man snapped. Panic became pure terror. Not for herself. For the baby. Adriana fought wildly despite the pain shooting through her abdomen. Rain soaked her clothes while one attacker dragged her toward a black van parked beside the harbor docks. Thunder cracked overhead so loudly it shook the windows nearby. Then gunfire exploded through the storm. One of the attackers collapsed instantly. The second man spun around reaching for his weapon, but another shot tore through the rain and dropped him beside the curb. Everything happened too fast afterward. Black SUVs roared onto Harbor Street from both directions, headlights blinding through the storm while armed men flooded the street with military precision. Doors slammed, commands shouted, weapons drawn. And then Adriana saw him. Matteo Morti stepped out of the lead SUV wearing a black wool coat darkened by rain, his expression colder than death itself. Blood streaked across one of his knuckles from the gunfight, but he barely seemed aware of it. His eyes locked onto Adriana standing trembling beneath the storm, and for one terrible moment all the brutality vanished from his face. Only fear remained. Fear for her. Adriana. The sound of her name and his voice nearly shattered her. He crossed the street toward her immediately, but Adriana stumbled backward before he could touch her. Months of heartbreak surged violently back to the surface all at once. You don't get to say my name anymore, she whispered brokenly. Rain poured between them. Matteo stopped moving. For several seconds neither spoke, while sirens echoed faintly somewhere in the distance. Then pain suddenly tore through Adriana's stomach so sharply, she gasped aloud and doubled forward, instinctively clutching her abdomen. Matteo's face changed instantly. Pure panic. He caught her before she collapsed onto the pavement. Bella. Don't, she whispered through clenched teeth, tears mixing with rainwater. Don't call me that after what you did. Another cramp hit harder than the first. Matteo wrapped both arms around her without hesitation now, holding her protectively against his chest, while his entire body shook with barely controlled rage. Get the doctor on the phone now, he roared toward his men. Lightning flashed violently across the harbor behind them. Adriana tried pushing him away weakly. I'm not going back with you. You are tonight. You divorced me. His jaw tightened painfully. I tried to save you. The words stunned her silent. Before she could answer, one of Matteo's soldiers dragged the wounded Russian attacker across the wet pavement. The man coughed blood while glaring upward hatefully. Matteo's expression turned murderous instantly. Who sent you? The Russian laughed, weakly despite the blood running from his mouth. You really don't know, he whispered. The traitor sleeping inside your empire already sold her to Sokolov weeks ago. The storm suddenly felt much colder. Because Matteo realized at the exact same moment Adriana did. Someone inside the Morti family wanted her dead. The safe house stood deep within the White Mountains of New Hampshire, hidden behind miles of frozen pine forest and winding roads buried beneath fresh snow. From a distance, it looked abandoned, nothing more than an old stone lodge overlooking a black lake half covered in ice. But hidden cameras watched every approach road, armed guards rotated through the surrounding woods in silence, and motion sensors lined the frozen tree line like invisible tripwires waiting for death to cross them. Nobody could reach Adriana here. At least that was what Matteo kept telling himself. Inside the lodge, fire crackled violently in the massive stone fireplace while snow hammered against the tall windows hard enough to sound like handfuls of gravel thrown from the darkness outside. The storm had trapped them there for 2 days already. Roads were nearly impassable, helicopters grounded, communications limited. And for the first time in nearly 7 months, Matteo and Adriana were forced to exist in the same silence again. But this silence was different. This silence bled. Adriana sat curled near the fireplace, wrapped in one of Matteo's oversized black sweaters, her hands resting protectively over the curve of her stomach while exhaustion hollowed her face. The attack at the harbor had shaken her badly. The doctor Matteo flew in privately from Boston confirmed the baby remained safe, but stress contractions had become increasingly dangerous. Adriana needed calm now, stability. Both things impossible around Matteo Morty. Across the room, Matteo stood near the frost-covered windows speaking quietly into a secure phone while shadows from the fire moved across his face. He had barely slept since the harbor attack. His jaw remained tense constantly, his eyes darker than Adriana remembered them. More dangerous, too. The wounded Russian attacker had survived long enough to give them one terrifying piece of information before dying from blood loss during transport. Someone inside the Morty Empire had sold Adriana's location to Viktor Sokolov. And Matteo still did not know who. Double security rotations, Matteo ordered coldly into the phone. Nobody enters the estate in Chicago without Luca personally clearing them first. A pause. Then his voice became lethal. And if I discover even one more leak inside my family, I'll bury everyone involved myself. He ended the call sharply. For several moments he simply stood there staring into the storm outside while thunder rolled through the mountains. Adriana watched him carefully from across the room. In Chicago he had always looked untouchable, controlled, like a man carved from marble and violence. But here beneath firelight and exhaustion, cracks had begun appearing in him. Human cracks. Finally Matteo turned toward her. You should rest. Adriana looked away immediately. I'm not tired. It was a lie. Her body ached constantly now. Pregnancy had become heavier these past weeks, especially under stress. Yet what exhausted her most was not physical pain. It was him. Being near him again reopened wounds she had spent months trying to survive. Matteo crossed the room slowly before stopping beside the fireplace. Neither spoke at first. Outside, wind screamed across the frozen lake while firelight flickered across the old wooden walls. Then Adriana finally broke. You divorced me while I was carrying your child. The words landed like bullets between them. Matteo closed his eyes briefly. I didn't know, but you still divorced me. Pain sharpened her voice now. Do you know what it felt like standing in that ballroom while your grandmother looked at me like I was defective? Her breathing trembled harder. Do you know what it felt like hearing people whisper that I failed your bloodline? Matteo remained motionless. Adriana stood suddenly despite the exhaustion weighing on her body. Tears burned fiercely in her amber eyes now. You stood there and said nothing, she whispered. That's the part that destroyed me, not the divorce, not the humiliation, your silence. Something inside Matteo finally snapped. You think silence was easy for me? His voice rose for the first time, rough with restrained emotion. You think I slept after those dinners while they treated you like a machine that failed? He stepped closer suddenly. Every time they spoke about replacing you, I wanted to put a bullet through the table. Then why didn't you stop them? The question shattered the room into silence again. Matteo stared at her for several seconds before answering quietly. Because I thought letting you hate me was safer than letting them destroy you slowly. Adriana frowned painfully. Matteo looked away toward the fire, his expression growing distant, older somehow. When I was 10 years old, he said quietly, my mother was killed because my father loved her openly. Adriana froze. Matteo had never spoken about his mother before. Never. The fire cracked loudly behind them, while snow continued falling outside. I still remember the blood on the marble floor, he continued in a hollow voice. I remember hearing my father scream her name. His jaw tightened violently, and after she died, my father became weak. Enemies sensed it. Men betrayed him. The family nearly collapsed. Adriana watched him carefully now, her anger slowly mixing with something else. Grief. For years I convinced myself love was dangerous, Matteo admitted quietly, that if I ever truly loved someone, I had to protect them by keeping distance. His eyes finally lifted toward hers again. Then you walked into my life and ruined every rule I ever built. Her breath caught softly. The storm outside intensified harder against the windows. Matteo stepped closer until only inches separated them now. I divorced you because the council was preparing to force a succession marriage. His voice lowered painfully. I thought if I let you go publicly, they would stop targeting you. Adriana stared at him in disbelief. You tried to sacrifice yourself. No, Matteo shook his head slowly. I sacrificed us. Silence fell again. Then suddenly, the baby kicked hard beneath Adriana's hand. She gasped softly. Matteo froze instantly. Without thinking, his hand moved toward her stomach before stopping halfway, uncertain for the first time in years. Adriana looked at him for one long moment, then slowly placed his hand against her stomach herself. Another kick answered instantly beneath his palm. Matteo stopped breathing. The world disappeared around him completely. The fire, the storm, the war waiting outside those mountains. None of it existed anymore. Only this. Only her. Only the tiny life moving beneath his trembling hand. And for the first time since that night beneath the black chandeliers, Matteo Morti looked at Adriana Bellucci, not like a mafia don staring at his former wife, but like a man realizing he was about to lose the only family he had ever truly wanted. The storm over the White Mountains did not end for 3 straight days. Snow buried the roads deeper with every passing hour until the entire world beyond the safe house disappeared beneath white silence and black pine shadows. Inside the stone lodge, tension grew heavier than the storm itself. Armed guards rotated through the hallways with rifles beneath their coats. Radios crackled at all hours. Luca Romano barely slept anymore, spending night after night reviewing security feeds, while Matteo's enemies circled somewhere beyond the mountains like wolves waiting for weakness. And yet the greatest danger inside the safe house was no longer Viktor Sokolov. It was the truth. Adriana felt it long before anyone spoke about it aloud. Something had shifted inside Matteo after that night beside the fireplace when he felt the baby kick beneath his hand. He no longer looked at her with guarded distance. Now he watched her constantly, like a man trying to memorize every breath she took because he feared losing her again. That terrified her more than hatred ever could, because loving Matteo Morti had already destroyed her once. Late one evening, Adriana wandered downstairs unable to sleep while freezing wind howled across the mountains outside. The lodge remained mostly dark except for the faint amber glow coming from the kitchen. As she stepped closer, she froze quietly in the doorway. Matteo stood alone at the wooden counter wearing only a black thermal shirt and dark sweatpants. His sleeves rolled to his elbows, while steam rose from a pot on the stove. For several seconds, Adriana simply stared, confused by the strange domestic softness of the scene. This was the same man who had once ordered executions with a single sentence, now standing under dim kitchen lights at 2 in the morning, carefully reading instructions from a handwritten recipe card. "You're awake," he said without turning around. Adriana crossed her arms lightly over her stomach. "What are you doing?" Matteo glanced toward the stove almost awkwardly. "The doctor said you need to eat more." The answer stunned her silent. A strange warmth moved painfully through her chest. Before she could respond, headlights suddenly flashed through the snow-covered windows outside. Every muscle in Matteo's body tightened instantly. In less than 2 seconds, the softness vanished from him completely. The Mafia Don returned. He pulled a handgun from beneath the counter with smooth, deadly instinct, while alarms quietly activated throughout the lodge. Upstairs, Footsteps thundered across the floor as guards rushed toward defensive positions. Adriana's heartbeat accelerated violently. "Stay behind me," Matteo ordered coldly. Another black SUV emerged through the storm outside before stopping near the front gate. Armed guards surrounded the vehicle immediately while snow whipped across the headlights in violent waves. Luca's voice crackled through Matteo's earpiece. "One passenger, elderly female, says she knows you." Matteo frowned slightly. Nobody knew the safe house existed. Nobody except his most trusted inner circle. The front door opened moments later. An older woman stepped slowly inside wearing a long black wool coat dusted with snow and a dark veil partially covering silver hair. She looked elegant despite the storm, but exhaustion lined her face deeply. The guards remained tense around her, weapons lowered but ready. Then the woman lifted her eyes toward Matteo, and the entire room changed. Adriana felt it instantly. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The same dark eyes, the same sharp cheekbones, the same controlled stillness beneath pain. Matteo stared at her motionlessly. For the first time since Adriana had known him, genuine confusion crossed his face. The woman removed her gloves slowly. Her hands trembled slightly. "Matteo," she whispered. His expression hardened immediately. "Who are you?" The woman looked at him for several long seconds before answering. "My name is Elena Morty." Silence swallowed the room. Matteo's jaw tightened violently. "No." The woman stepped closer, tears already forming in her eyes. "I know you were told I died." Adriana felt the temperature inside the lodge drop instantly. Because Matteo's mother had been dead for 26 years. Everyone knew that story. Matteo himself had once told Adriana how she was murdered during a mafia war when he was 10 years old. Now this woman stood alive before him. "That's impossible," Matteo said coldly, though something unstable had begun breaking beneath his voice. "My mother died in Milan." "No," Elena whispered painfully. "Your mother disappeared because someone inside the Morty family wanted control of the empire." The room became deathly silent. Luca slowly lowered his weapon. Matteo stared at the woman like his entire world had begun collapsing beneath his feet. Elena reached slowly into her coat pocket and removed an old silver necklace with a small cross attached to it. Matteo's face changed instantly. Adriana recognized the look immediately. Recognition. Pain. Memory. Matteo stepped backward slowly as though physically struck. "Where did you get that?" Elena's eyes filled with tears now. "You gave this to me on your 10th birthday." Her voice trembled harder. "You said it would keep me safe while you were at school." The color drained from Matteo's face completely. Because only his mother could have known that. Outside, thunder rolled violently across the mountain, while snow battered the lodge windows hard enough to shake the glass. Matteo looked suddenly unsteady. 26 years of grief, rage, and loss cracked open all at once behind his eyes. "I buried you," he whispered hoarsely. "I stood beside your grave." Elena shook her head slowly through tears. That grave was empty. Adriana's heart pounded painfully now, as realization spread through the room. Someone had staged Elena Morty's death. Someone powerful enough to deceive the entire family. And if that was true, then everything Matteo believed about his childhood had been a lie. Elena stepped closer carefully. "Your uncle Riccardo arranged it," she whispered. "He told the family I was dead because I discovered he was working with the Russians long before your father's murder." The room exploded into silence. Even the storm outside seemed distant now. Matteo stopped breathing. Because Riccardo Morty was not only his uncle. He was the man currently helping manage the Morty Empire back in Chicago. And suddenly, Adriana understood the horrifying truth. The betrayal inside the family had never ended. It had only been sleeping for 26 years. After Elena Morty's arrival, the safe house no longer felt hidden from the world. It felt hunted. The storm outside finally began weakening after nearly a week of relentless snowfall, but the silence that settled over the mountains afterward carried something far more dangerous than thunder. It carried waiting, the kind of waiting predators did before tearing flesh apart. Inside the lodge, nobody slept peacefully anymore. Matteo locked himself for hours inside the downstairs study with Luca and Alina while maps, financial records, old photographs, and encrypted files spread across the oak table like pieces of a 30-year conspiracy finally beginning to surface. Adriana heard fragments of conversations through the hallway at night. Russian shipping routes, offshore accounts, missing witnesses, names of dead capos connected to betrayals no one had ever solved. And always one name repeated beneath lowered voices. Riccardo Morti, the man Matteo had trusted almost like a second father. The realization hollowed him out visibly. Adriana saw it every time he thought no one was watching, the tension in his shoulders, the sleepless exhaustion darkening his eyes, the moments he stared silently at Alina across the room as though still trying to convince himself she was real and not some cruel hallucination born from grief. But despite everything collapsing around him, Matteo never stopped protecting Adriana. Never. 2 guards remained outside her bedroom door every hour of the day. Matteo personally checked every meal before she ate. Every night he sat beside her until she fell asleep, one hand resting gently against her stomach, as though grounding himself to the only thing still pure in his life. And that terrified Adriana more than the danger outside, because she was falling in love with him all over again. On the 8th night after Alina's arrival, Adriana woke suddenly to sharp pain twisting low in her abdomen. She gasped softly, clutching the blankets while panic surged instantly through her body. Another contraction hit harder than before. Too early. No. Fear exploded through her chest. Before she could even call out, Matteo was already awake beside her. Years of mafia instinct had trained him to rise at the smallest sound. He sat upright instantly, his face tightening with alarm when he saw her expression. Bella. She grabbed his wrist hard. Something's wrong. The room changed instantly. Matteo switched on the bedside lamp while Adriana fought through another wave of pain, her breathing becoming uneven. 7.5 months. The doctor had warned them stress could trigger premature labor if her body endured too much trauma. And the past weeks had been nothing except trauma. Matteo reached for the phone immediately. Get Dr. Rosen downstairs now. Outside the bedroom, footsteps thundered through the hallway as guards moved instantly. But before anyone reached the room, the entire safe house suddenly went black. Every light died at once. Darkness swallowed everything. For one terrible second, silence filled the mountains. Then gunfire erupted outside. The first explosion shattered the front security gate hard enough to shake the entire lodge. Adriana screamed instinctively, while Matteo pulled her against him protectively as bullets tore through the lower windows downstairs. Move, Luca roared somewhere below. Chaos exploded instantly. More gunfire echoed through the forest while alarms screamed across the property. Through the bedroom windows, Adriana saw headlights flooding through the snow-covered trees below. Black SUVs, armed men spilling across the property. The attack had finally come. Matteo grabbed the handgun from beneath the bedside table with deadly calm despite the fury burning in his eyes. Stay behind me. Another explosion thundered through the lodge. Wood splintered downstairs. The enemy had breached the first floor. Adriana's heart pounded violently as Matteo led her into the hallway where guards already exchanged gunfire down the staircase. Smoke drifted upward through the lodge while bullets tore through walls below. And then Adriana saw something worse than the attack itself. One of the Morty guards suddenly turned his weapon on another guard and shot him point-blank in the chest. Betrayal. There were traitors inside the safe house. Riccardo's men, Luca snarled while firing down the hallway. Matteo's face became terrifyingly still. Not rage. Something colder. Murderous understanding. His uncle had not only betrayed him. He had sent assassins to finish the bloodline entirely. Another contraction slammed through Adriana so violently her knees nearly gave out. Matteo caught her instantly before she collapsed. Fear finally cracked openly across his face now. "She's in labor." The words hit the room like another gunshot. "No," Adriana whispered through tears. "It's too early." Outside, engines roared closer through the storm, while flames from the lower floor began spreading across the walls beneath them. The lodge was becoming a death trap. Matteo made his decision instantly. "We leave now." Luca nodded sharply. "North exit is still clear." Matteo wrapped one arm tightly around Adriana while firing his weapon, one-handed down the staircase, with terrifying precision. The group moved quickly through smoke-filled corridors toward the rear garage where armored vehicles waited hidden beneath the lodge. Bullets shattered windows around them. One guard fell. Another screamed somewhere behind them. The mountains echoed with violence. When they finally burst into the underground garage beneath the lodge, Matteo shoved Adriana carefully into the armored SUV before climbing behind the wheel himself. Luca and Elena entered the second vehicle behind them while surviving guards returned fire toward the approaching attackers. Then Adriana saw him, standing near the burning trees beyond the lodge. Viktor Sokolov. Snow fell across his black overcoat while flames reflected in his cold silver eyes. He watched the escaping vehicles with calm amusement, almost smiling, as though he already knew something Matteo did not. The convoy roared out into the frozen mountain roads moments, before another explosion tore through the safe house behind them. And deep inside the armored SUV, racing through darkness and snow, Adriana clutched her stomach in terror as another contraction hit harder than all the others. Because her baby was coming. And somewhere behind them, war had officially begun. The armored SUV tore through the mountain roads like a wounded beast fleeing death itself. Snow blasted against the windshield so violently, the world beyond the headlights disappeared into swirling white chaos. Tires skidded across black ice while pine trees rushed past like shadows waiting to swallow them whole. Somewhere far behind them, the safe house burned against the mountainside, flames staining the storm-dark sky orange like the funeral pyre of everything Matteo Morty had once believed secure. Inside the vehicle, Adriana screamed. The sound ripped through Matteo harder than gunfire ever could. Another contraction crushed through her body with brutal force while she gripped the leather seat so tightly her knuckles turned white. Sweat soaked her hair despite the freezing temperature outside. Her breathing had become ragged now, broken by pain and terror. "It's too soon," she whispered desperately through tears. "Matteo, something's wrong." Matteo drove one-handed through the blizzard, while the other gripped Adriana's trembling fingers so tightly it almost hurt. He had blood across his jaw from the firefight at the lodge, powder burns staining the sleeve of his black coat, but none of it mattered anymore. Nothing mattered except her. "Stay with me," he ordered hoarsely, though fear was beginning to poison even his voice. "You hear me? Look at me, Bella." She tried. God, she tried. But another wave of pain bent her forward with a cry sharp enough to make Matteo's entire chest tighten in panic. Behind them, Luca's SUV flashed its headlights twice. Danger signal. Matteo checked the rearview mirror and saw them instantly. Two black vehicles cutting through the snowstorm behind the convoy at impossible speed. Sokolov's men. "They found us again," Luca's voice crackled through the radio. Matteo's expression darkened into something lethal. "Keep them off us." Gunfire erupted seconds later. Bullets sparked against the armored rear panels, while Luca's men returned fire through half-open windows, despite the freezing wind screaming into the vehicles. The mountain road curved sharply around a cliffside buried beneath snowdrifts, while engines roared through darkness and death. Then the first enemy, SUV, lost control on black ice. Matteo saw it spin violently before smashing through the guardrail and disappearing into the ravine below. A fireball exploded seconds later. But the second vehicle kept coming. Relentless. Another contraction hit Adriana harder than all the others. She cried out, and suddenly Matteo saw blood. Not much, but enough. Pure terror seized him completely. No, he whispered instantly. Adriana looked at him through tears, shaking uncontrollably now. Matteo. He slammed the steering wheel violently. There has to be a hospital somewhere. There isn't, Alina said quietly from the backseat, her pale face grim beneath the flashing dashboard lights. Not for another 60 miles. Adriana sobbed softly. The baby was coming now. And all around them the storm worsened. Lightning flashed violently across the mountains ahead, briefly illuminating something through the blizzard. A small stone chapel. Old, isolated, perched near the edge of the forest like a forgotten relic buried by time. Matteo turned the wheel instantly. The convoy slid violently across snow before racing toward the chapel as more gunfire exploded behind them. Luca's men stayed back deliberately now, engaging the pursuing SUV directly while Matteo carried Adriana farther into the storm. The chapel doors burst open beneath Matteo's shoulder moments later. Warm candlelight flickered softly inside. An elderly nun looked up in shock from near the altar as Snow and armed men suddenly stormed into her sanctuary. Before she could speak, Matteo carried Adriana straight toward the wooden pews while Alina quickly explained between breaths. She's in labor. The nun crossed herself instantly. Within minutes, the tiny chapel transformed into an emergency delivery room lit only by candles and storm lightning. Old blankets were gathered. Water boiled over ancient stoves. Adriana lay trembling across a narrow wooden bench near the altar while contractions tore through her body harder and faster now. Outside, gunfire echoed faintly through the forest. Sokolov's remaining men had followed them into the mountains. Matteo knelt beside Adriana, gripping her hand while she cried through another contraction, tears streaming down her face. He had never looked helpless before, not once in his life, but now panic bled openly through every part of him. "This is my fault," he whispered brokenly. Adriana shook her head weakly. "I brought death to you," he said hoarsely. "I should have protected you better." Another contraction stole her breath before she answered. "You came for me," she whispered painfully. "Nobody has ever done that before." The words shattered something inside him. Outside the chapel, Luca burst through the doors covered in snow and blood. "We don't have much time," he warned grimly. "More vehicles are coming." Matteo stood instantly, drawing his weapon. But Adriana grabbed his wrist weakly before he could leave. Fear filled her eyes. Not fear of dying. Fear of losing him. Matteo looked down at her trembling hand, holding his, and something inside him finally broke completely. He dropped to his knees beside her again, pressing his forehead against hers while storm winds screamed beyond the chapel walls. "I love you," he whispered for the first time in 5 years. "God help me, Bella, I never stopped." Adriana began crying harder than before. Not from pain. From finally hearing the words she thought she would die without. Then the baby came. The chapel filled with Adriana's scream as lightning exploded across the mountains outside. Matteo held her through every second, whispering desperately against her hair, while Alina and the nun guided the delivery with trembling hands. Minutes later, a tiny cry finally pierced through the storm. Small, weak, but alive. The world stopped. The nun carefully lifted the newborn child, wrapped in blankets, while candlelight flickered softly across his tiny face. "A boy," she whispered tearfully. Matteo stared in complete silence. His son. His miracle. The child opened his eyes weakly beneath the candlelight. Dark eyes. Adriana's eyes. And in that tiny moment, standing inside a snowstorm-shaken chapel while war raged outside its doors, Matteo Morty, feared by all of Chicago, felt tears slide silently down his face for the first time since childhood. But the peace lasted only seconds. Because outside the chapel, headlights suddenly appeared through the storm. And Viktor Sokolov himself had finally arrived. The newborn's cry still echoed softly through the tiny mountain chapel when death arrived outside its doors. Headlights cut through the blizzard one by one until the snow-covered clearing glowed beneath harsh white beams. Black SUVs emerged from the storm like predators crawling out of darkness, their engines rumbling low against the violent wind tearing through the mountains. The chapel windows trembled faintly beneath the sound. Inside, silence swallowed everyone. Matteo stood frozen beside Adriana, his newborn son wrapped carefully in his arms for the first time in his life. The tiny child had stopped crying now, resting weakly against his father's chest while candlelight flickered softly across his small face. For one impossible moment Matteo looked peaceful. Human. Then Luca stepped toward the stained glass window, and his expression hardened instantly. They've surrounded the chapel. The room changed at once. Guards checked weapons. Elena pulled Adriana protectively closer beneath layers of blankets while the elderly nun crossed herself repeatedly near the altar. Outside, shadows moved through the snowstorm carrying rifles beneath black coats. Viktor Sokolov had come personally for the end. Matteo looked down at the child in his arms, and something terrifying entered his eyes. Not fear. A father's violence. He handed the baby carefully to Adriana before kneeling beside her. His gloved hand cupped her face, gently despite the war exploding outside the chapel walls. Listen to me carefully, he said quietly. Adriana shook her head instantly through tears. No. If anything happens. No. Her voice cracked sharply enough to silence even the storm for a second. You are not saying goodbye to me again. Pain crossed Matteo's face. Outside, car doors slammed shut through the snow. Luca moved closer fast. We don't have much time. Matteo ignored him completely. His forehead rested briefly against Adriana's, while their son slept between them beneath layers of blankets and candlelight. I wasted 5 years loving you silently, he whispered roughly. I won't waste another second pretending you aren't my entire life. Adriana cried harder. Then suddenly, a loudspeaker echoed outside the chapel. Don Matto Mortti. Sokolov's voice rolled through the mountains like thunder. I know you're inside. Silence followed briefly before the Russian continued almost calmly. You can still end this tonight. Bring me Riccardo Morti's files and I let the woman and child live. Matteo's expression darkened instantly. So that was the true objective. Not revenge. The files Elena brought from Chicago. Evidence exposing decades of corruption between Russian syndicates and powerful politicians connected to the Morty empire. Information capable of collapsing entire criminal networks across America. And Riccardo, Morty wanted those files destroyed before Matteo could expose him publicly. Another voice suddenly interrupted from the chapel entrance. Elena stepped forward slowly. Her face had gone pale beneath the candlelight, but something fierce burned behind her eyes now. A mother's fury long buried beneath 26 years of silence. This never ends unless Riccardo falls, she said quietly. Matteo looked toward her sharply. Elena held his gaze steadily. Your uncle won't stop hunting your family while he still has power. The word family hit the room softly. Matteo's jaw tightened. Because for the first time in his life, he truly had one. Outside, Sokolov's men began advancing slowly through the snow toward the chapel. Weapons raised. Luca cursed under his breath. They're moving. Matteo stood instantly, all softness vanishing from him again. The Mafia Don returned beneath firelight and storm shadows. He checked his weapon calmly while guards prepared defensive positions behind pews and stone pillars. Then Adriana's voice stopped him. Matteo. He turned back. She held their son against her chest now, tears still shining across her exhausted face. Come back to us. 3 simple words. But they shattered through every wall inside him. Matteo crossed the room immediately, cupped the back of her neck, and kissed her with desperate intensity beneath candlelight and gunmetal shadows. It was not the cold, controlled kiss of a mafia king. It was survival. Promise. Love finally spoken without silence between them. When he pulled away, his forehead rested against hers one final second. I swear it. Then the first bullets shattered the chapel windows. Glass exploded across the wooden floor as gunfire erupted outside. Matteo spun instantly, firing back with deadly precision, while Luca's men answered from behind overturned pews. The peaceful chapel transformed into a battlefield within seconds. Smoke filled the air. Candles toppled. The storm screamed through broken stained glass. Sokolov's men breached the front entrance violently, but Matteo moved through them like death itself. Years of brutality and warfare sharpened every movement into something terrifyingly efficient. One attacker fell before even crossing the doorway. Another collapsed near the altar beneath 2 shots to the chest. But there were too many. Far too many. Outside the rear chapel windows, more armed men circled through the snow. Luca fired beside Matteo while shouting over gunfire, "They're trapping us." Another explosion shook the building violently. The side wall partially collapsed beneath the blast, sending stone and wood crashing across the floor. Adriana screamed instinctively while shielding the baby beneath her body. Then through the smoke and chaos, Viktor Sokolov himself entered the chapel. Tall, calm, snow dusting his black overcoat. His silver eyes locked directly onto Matteo. And slowly, horrifyingly, Sokolov smiled. "You finally understand now," he said almost softly. "Family is always the weakness." Matteo raised his weapon instantly. But before he could fire, another gunshot exploded from behind him. Everything stopped. Matteo staggered suddenly. Blood spread slowly across the black fabric near his ribs. Adriana's scream tore through the chapel. And standing behind Matteo, with a smoking handgun in his trembling hand, was Luca Romano. The gunshot echoed through the burning chapel like the sound of destiny, finally breaking apart. For one impossible second, nobody moved. Matteo looked down slowly at the blood spreading across his ribs beneath the black fabric of his coat, while snow and ash drifted through shattered stained glass windows around him. His breathing turned uneven. Shock crossed his face first, then something far more painful. Recognition. Luca Romano stood several feet behind him with the handgun still trembling in his grasp. His expression looked shattered already, like a man who had hated himself long before pulling the trigger. Adriana screamed Matteo's name so violently her voice cracked. The newborn began crying instantly in her arms. And Viktor Sokolov smiled. Not with joy. With victory. "I warned you," Sokolov said calmly over the chaos. "Family is weakness, loyalty is fantasy." Matteo staggered slightly but did not fall. Blood dripped steadily onto the chapel floor beneath him, while storm winds howled through the ruined walls. His ice-cold eyes lifted toward Luca. "Why?" The single word nearly destroyed Luca completely. Tears filled the man's eyes instantly. "Ricardo has my daughter." The confession shattered through the chapel harder than gunfire. "He took her 3 months ago," Luca whispered brokenly. "He said if I didn't help him, she'd disappear forever." Adriana felt sick instantly. Another betrayal. Another life destroyed by Ricardo Morty's hunger for power. Luca lowered the weapon slowly, his entire body shaking now. "I tried to protect you," he said desperately toward Matteo. "I swear I tried, but he owns judges, police, senators. There's nowhere to hide from him." Sokolov stepped forward calmly through drifting smoke. "Enough." His silver eyes locked onto Matteo again. "Give me the files." Matteo laughed suddenly. The sound horrified everyone in the room because blood still poured from his side, while he laughed like a man who had finally stopped fearing death. "You really think this ends with papers?" Matteo asked darkly. Sokolov's expression shifted slightly. Matteo slowly reached inside his coat, while Adriana's heart nearly stopped. Not for a weapon. For his phone. Then he pressed one button. Far away beyond the mountains, somewhere deep within Chicago, Every secret Riccardo Morty had spent 26 years burying began releasing automatically to federal agencies, journalists, judges, and rival syndicates across America. Bank records, murder orders, political bribes, Russian trafficking routes. Everything. Sokolov realized it instantly. His face changed for the first time. No. Mateo smiled through blood and pain. You're already dead. The chapel exploded into violence again. Sokolov roared furiously and raised his weapon, but Luka moved first. The betrayed consigliere threw himself directly into Sokolov's line of fire as bullets erupted through the room. Gunfire shattered wood and stone, while Mateo's remaining guards attacked from both sides simultaneously. Luka took 2 bullets protecting Mateo before crashing into Sokolov hard enough to drive both men through the burning side wall of the chapel and into the snowstorm outside. Adriana screamed again. Mateo immediately dropped beside her despite blood loss weakening him rapidly now. He pressed one hand against his wound while pulling her and the baby lower behind overturned pews. You have to leave, he ordered roughly. No. Bella, I am not losing you. Gunfire continued exploding outside, while flames spread higher through the collapsing chapel ceiling. Alina helped shield the newborn beneath blankets while smoke thickened around them dangerously. Then suddenly, silence. The gunfire stopped. The storm outside still screamed through the mountains, but the battle itself had ended. Mateo rose slowly despite Adriana begging him not to. He stepped through the shattered chapel doorway into knee-deep snow beneath burning skies. And there he saw the end. Luca Romano lay dying against the frozen ground, blood staining the snow black beneath him. Several feet away, Viktor Sokolov's body rested motionless beside the trees with a single bullet through his throat. Luca had killed him. With his final breaths, Mateo knelt beside his oldest friend, while snow fell heavily around them both. I'm sorry, Luca whispered weakly. I tried to save my little girl. Mateo's eyes closed briefly. She'll be safe now. Luca smiled faintly through blood. You were the best man I ever knew, brother. Then he died beneath the snowfall. Mateo remained kneeling there silently, while dawn slowly began rising behind the mountains for the first time in days. By sunrise, helicopters arrived. Federal raids exploded across Chicago, New York, and Miami simultaneously after Mateo's files exposed one of the largest criminal political conspiracies in modern American history. Judges vanished into custody. Senators resigned within hours. Russian operations collapsed overnight. And Riccardo Morty disappeared before authorities could arrest him. But not forever. 3 months later, Mateo found him hiding inside a private villa along the Sicilian coast. Nobody ever learned exactly what happened inside that villa. Only that Mateo walked out alone at sunrise, wearing the same black coat he had worn the night Adriana nearly died. And Riccardo Morty was never seen again. 1 year later, winter returned softly to Chicago. But the Morty mansion no longer felt cold. The black chandeliers still hung above the ballroom ceilings, yet laughter now echoed through halls once ruled by silence and fear. Armed guards remained outside the estate because some dangers never vanished completely, but inside those walls, something new had finally been built. A family. Adriana stood beside the grand piano in the East Wing one snowy evening, while soft music drifted through the mansion. Her long ivory dress moved gently around her ankles as she smiled toward the small child wobbling unsteadily across the carpet toward Mateo. Little Leonardo Morty had his father's dark hair and his mother's warm amber eyes, a miracle child once believed impossible. Mateo caught the boy easily in his arms, and for the 1000th time, Adriana felt her heart stop slightly watching the feared mafia don melt completely for his son. The empire had changed too. Mateo dismantled most of the old syndicate operations after the war with Riccardo ended. Legitimate businesses replaced blood money. Violence disappeared piece by piece from the family legacy. It was not redemption completely. Men like Matteo Morty were too stained by darkness for innocence. But Adriana had taught him something greater than power. She taught him how to choose love anyway. That night, after Leonardo finally fell asleep upstairs, Adriana found Matteo standing alone beside the ballroom windows watching snow fall over Chicago beneath the city lights. The same ballroom, the same black chandeliers, the same place where he once destroyed both their hearts believing silence could protect them. Adriana walked toward him slowly. Matteo turned immediately, his expression softening the way it only ever softened for her. She placed his hand gently against her stomach again. A familiar gesture. Matteo froze, then slowly looked up at her. Adriana smiled through tears. Twins. For several seconds, Matteo simply stared at her like a man who had survived war only to be handed heaven afterward. Then he laughed. Not the cold laugh of a mafia king. Not the dangerous laugh feared across Chicago. But the broken, grateful laugh of a man who once believed love would destroy him, only to discover it was the one thing powerful enough to save him. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the city, while inside the Morty mansion, beneath the black chandeliers that once witnessed their ending, Matteo and Adriana finally began their forever.